chapter 20, verses 24 through 28. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked and shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." The second reading. So this is my son Luke, if anybody doesn't know. So there was one day where a little boy went to Sunday school, and as he was in Sunday school, he had learned a lesson, and when he got home, his dad had asked him, "So what did you learn in Sunday school today?" So the little boy started to tell this story about how this army general Moses was fighting against the king of Egypt. And in this great battle, they ended up at a great body of water. And Moses called to one of his engineers and said, "Hey, we need to build some pontoons to make a land bridge so we can get across. And while you're doing that, I want you to set charges. So once we get to the other side, we can blow the bridge and get rid of the army that's chasing us." And so then the father looked at the little boy and he says, "I really don't think your Sunday school teacher told you that story."
No, but you wouldn't believe what she did tell me.
Thank you, buddy. So that story, although funny, I think it does hit close to home for many of us. Sometimes the stories that we hear are just so fanciful that it's hard to believe that these events could have even taken place. When I was growing up, I had always questioned Christianity. It was the religion that I was raised in. My dad always making me go to church. I just really wondered if all these stories that I had been taught were real. In school, I was taught to be a scientist. Even before I was ever a Christian, a real Christian where, I actually believed and did the things that God's Word said. I learned how to study, I learned how to investigate, I learned how to test. I studied major world religions throughout my high school years, and Christianity caught my attention. Out of all the religions that I was studying, this was the one that to get the end product, to get enlightenment, whatever it was that they were searching for, this Christianity was the only one that said you can't do it on your own. All the rest had a way that you could do it, a way to touch that other. As I dove deeper into Christianity, I used the tools that I had been taught all my life to investigate the claims of Christianity. And today, we're going to look at doubt. In the Greek, it is the word pistis. And so, if you have doubt, it's actually the word apistis. In the Greek, you put an A in front of the word, it reverses the word. So pistis is to have faith. Apistis is to have no faith or no belief. Pistis, the word for believing, the story of Gideon, we see that there's this man that is hiding from the Midianites. And while he hides, he is thrashing wheat while hiding in a vineyard. Now, I'm pretty sure that everybody here knows that, the process of making wine and the process of thrashing wheat are two completely separate things. But Gideon was hiding where they wouldn't have been looking for him so that he could grind up just enough grain to make bread for that day. It is here at this lowly part where Gideon, feeling defeated, down, hiding in a winepress, where God sends an angel to him. The angel comes and says, "Behold, the Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." However, I wondered to myself, how is this a mighty man of valor? So I dove into the Hebrew, and I found that there's some ambiguousness in the text and how it was translated by the King James. As I dug deeper, I found that the translators at some point had put the emphasis of mighty man onto Gideon, when the emphasis was really to be on the Lord. And so we would read a little more like this: "The Lord is by your side with a mighty army," or "The Lord is with you, the one who is mighty with strength." And again, the idea of strength with an army behind you. As we continue reading, we see that Gideon was a man beaten down. He didn't display any of the characters of a man of valor, at least not yet. When we read that Gideon's response, he says, what would we call, or his response was what we would call the vocabulary of doubt. In verse 15, he says to the angel, "Oh, my Lord, with what shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least of my father's house." He starts off by saying, "What do I have to save Israel? We are the poorest family in all the tribes, and on top of that, in my father's house, I am the least of all my brothers. Why would I be the one to free Israel?" As you see, Gideon could only see his shortcomings and doubted his potential to be used by God. I would love to develop that further, just the idea of letting God control your life and direct your path and the mighty things that you can do. But now, what about this Thomas, called Didymus, the twin? Thomas was a disciple that walked with Jesus for 3 years and watched Jesus perform many miracles. In John chapter 11, Jesus says that he is going to return to Jerusalem, where in an earlier incident, the Jews had tried to stone him. Thomas again shows his doubt that Jesus was nothing more than just a man, and he says, "Let us go, that we may die with him." Wow. Now, you can't say anything about his dedication to his friends. But on a side note, that was an intrinsic detail that didn't have to be added into the text in order to make this story what it was. And it's in these intrinsic details that we find that the writers are telling a story truthful the way that they had seen it. There's other little intrinsic details that you come across in the gospel testimonies. Most of us have read past them and didn't even pick up that that was a clue to the underlying text. Another one was the story that I was talking with the children about, where Jesus was about to feed the multitude. And within this feeding, he looks at one particular disciple. As he looks at his disciple Philip, he says, "Philip, where can we get bread?" It is only through the understanding of reading all 3 New Testament accounts that we see that it's because that was the neighborhood that Philip lived in. So it would be like me going up to Jim Blue one of the days when he's helping out in the kitchen and saying, "Hey, Jim, where can I find a really good roast beef sandwich around here?" I would ask him because I know that he lives around here. And that's exactly what Jesus did with Philip, because of the fact that he lived in that area. Intrinsic details. They help us to understand and to see that what is recorded is an honest account of what these people have experienced. Back to Thomas. Another time when Jesus was teaching, in John chapter 14, Jesus says, "My Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back so that you can be with me." If you can just imagine at that moment, I'm sure that some of the disciples, just from their characters, were jumping up and down thinking of this big house. I'm sure that there was a few of them that were looking around saying, "Oh, I hope my room is bigger than yours," or "I hope my room is right next to Jesus's." But then you have Thomas. Poor Thomas, the realist, as he was sitting back there, listening to Jesus talk, he says, "Lord, we do not know where you go, so how can we know the way?" He was definitely not afraid to speak whatever it was that he was thinking. In chapter 20, we again encounter Thomas, the doubter. And when he heard the news that Jesus lived, as our scripture reading earlier, he said that I will not believe until my finger touches the hole in his hand and my hand touches the side where he was pierced. Now, for us, historic certainty is gone once the event has happened. It is in the past and you can no longer be a witness. But there is eyewitness evidence that you can surround yourself with to decide, did a resurrection really happen? I know that that's a hang-up for not just Thomas, but that's a hang-up for a lot of people, including myself. I had to wade my way through that doubt. The resurrection was the one thing that I had to come to terms with because I had been offered a Jesus that was a good and wise teacher. But when I read the Jesus that he himself portrayed in the scriptures, he was either a madman or a liar, but could not be a good and wise teacher. If he believed in the things that he said about himself, he talked about heaven as if it was a place that he had been walking in, then he had to have been a madman. Or a liar, because a good and wise teacher would not tell the stories that he did just to have someone follow him. So if we are left to look at the evidence through the eyes of the witness accounts and determine for ourselves whether or not he was a lunatic, a liar, or Lord, to take from a title of a C.S. Lewis book on this topic. There have been many books written on this topic. There are so many. Josh McDowell's evidence that demands a verdict. And then there's a centuries-old one that's kind of hard to find, and I do have a digital copy of it, called Sherlock's Trial of the Witnesses, where they go through in a courtroom setting and they investigate, they question the witnesses, and they give their testimonies. There's usually about 5 to 10 questions that I can ask someone when talking about this that I can usually tell that they haven't spent much time in studying the resurrection. And something that is so pivotal to Christianity, but yet so very little studied. It's kind of an amazing thing because Paul says that if this did not happen, then we are liars and we are perpetuating a lie. One of the biggest things that stood out to me, especially after I took some classes in psychology, was that they had 11 eyewitnesses that went out to separate parts of the world, and all but John died a horrific death. Now, if these 11 disciples had stayed together, and while together they had a lateral commitment to keep this lie going, to keep this story going, just to save face because they ran around saying that he had been resurrected, I could see that they would have a reason to lie. However, they all were in separate parts of the world and alone and died horrific deaths. I found in Augustine's writing that he too found this peculiar, that all these men died alone while all they had to do was to say that Jesus did not come back from the dead. Dear Thomas, pierced through the Himalayan mountains into the plains of India, where still to this day Christians bear his name. And most people don't even know what happened to all the disciples or where they went. Thomas went into India preaching the gospel, the good news. He ended up dying by the sword of a Brahmin, either by piercing or his skin being filleted from his body. While being asked, will you recant the story of the resurrection? If it was a lie, how hard it is to believe that someone would go through what the disciples went through when all they had to do was say, no, it's not true. Any one of them could have very easily, while they were being tortured, said, no, this did not happen, let me go. And then if they happened to come back to Jerusalem and then happened to run into one of the other disciples, he could have said, oh, I held it good. I told the truth, and I kept this lie, and I said that, Jesus did not come back. But they didn't. They chose death over recanting the story of the resurrection. So in the beginning of Lost and Found, the ministry that I'm a part of, when I read this encounter of Thomas with Jesus, where God, who spoke and nothing, became everything, he didn't fall off the throne of eternity simply because one person had questions. Instead, it was a very loving Lord that came down to meet a man right where he was. He submitted himself to the very task that Thomas needed to believe in the scriptures. Jesus appeared to his disciples, and he simply said, "Peace be with you." This is the traditional Jewish greeting or goodbye. As you leave a friend, you would say shalom. And as you would come back again, you would say shalom. It's a word that means wholeness and peace. Jesus then says to Thomas, "Here I am. Put your finger in the hole of my hand. Put your hand in my side." There's a famous painting by Caravaggio, and in it, it shows Thomas coming to the Lord and very carefully with his hand going to touch the mark where the blade went and pierced his heart. But in the actual scriptures, it tells us a different story. It says that as soon as Thomas seen Jesus standing there with them, he said, "My Lord and my God." His doubt was now gone. He made peace with his unbelief, his apistis, and now he was living a life of pistis, faithing. Jesus then said, "Because you have seen me, you believe, but blessed are those who have not seen, but yet still believe." Now that statement for many years drove me crazy. For quite a while, I would look at it and I said, how typical of a religion to put this special little note that says, "Blessed are you who believe without seeing." Those kind of statements was what pushed me away from the church, and many times I had questions that none of my youth leaders could answer. None of my teachers had answers for, and all they could reply to me was, "Well, you need to have more faith." How frustrating, how infuriating at times. I would ask myself, why did I see these questions that other people did not? Then one day at a youth event, a pastor pulled me aside, and he said, "You really shouldn't ask such questions because people are going to doubt whether or not you are really saved." For some years after that, I stopped asking questions. I no longer sought after what God wanted for me in my life, and I lived a life that I wanted to, the life that I was at the helm, that I steered where I went. The questions never went away. But it wasn't until post-high school studies where I started to find that many of the questions I had did have answers. I had to dig between and under many years of church tradition. They had to be pulled from long-forgotten books. They had to be taken from the rabbis themselves in writings of the Hebrew Scriptures. And here's where I found many of the answers to my questions. It wasn't that I needed faith. It was that I had to search diligently for the truth. For me, if I was going to invest the rest of my life in following this book and to possibly raising my children to believe this book, these questions and doubts had to be answered for me. There's no way that in just 20 minutes I can pack for you some special thing that you can take with you and end your doubt. But I can say that there are answers out there. You do not have to exchange your faith for intelligence. You do not have to check your brain at the door as you come into church, only to be picked up again as you leave. The faith that I have is not built on the stoicism of, "I know Jesus lives because he lives within my heart." It is not built on a love for tradition either. My faith is built on facts. If you remember the Bible exhibit that I had displayed here wonderfully that the church had allowed me to, while it was up, those are many of the reasons and many stories that I had found along the way that I had questions to, things that I had doubted. In the scriptures, how it says that there was 2 different people that killed Goliath, and when you really dive into the Hebrew, you find that David killed Goliath, and Elian actually killed Goliath's brother because there was 5 of them. There was 4 others. You and I cannot go back and interview the witnesses, but their testimonies have been recorded. Paul named some of the witnesses by name and then circulated his letters. These letters, one particular, the one in Romans, went to Rome, was copied, and came back to the Holy Land to be sealed up in the Qumran caves. And we know that these caves were sealed sometime between 67 and 70 AD. So there were scriptures, well, at this time they weren't really scriptures, they're scriptures to us. But there were letters circulating with people's names in it that said, if you have any doubt that these things are true, go and ask so-and-so. And they could have been found and asked, was this true? It was only within 40 years of the resurrection. There were witnesses that Luke was able to go and find and interview them for future generations like us. He was an investigator that questioned the things that he had been hearing. And he went, and his gospel says that he has done this to make an orderly account. So whenever I'm doing studies and in the other gospels, I'm kind of questioning when these events happened, I usually run back to Luke's gospel to see how did he order it. So getting back to Thomas for one final time, that verse gave me so much trouble that said, blessed are those who believe without seeing. When I finally came out the other side of my doubt, I realized that what that verse really meant. For those who simply need to know that there was a Jesus and there's no question in their hearts, they are blessed because they do not have to wrestle with the burden of doubt. Others, they did not have the burden of doubt. So at that point, I finally understood that yes, they are blessed. They don't have to take their hand and thrust it into the wound of Christ in order to believe. Blessed are they that they do not have to lose countless hours of sleep as they track down these stories of history. Blessed are they that do not have to learn forgotten languages just to read the eyewitness accounts in their original tongue. Truly blessed are those that do not have to wrestle with doubt. I encourage you on your journey to seek out the historical eyewitnesses and their accounts. I encourage you to study the disciples and their walks before the resurrection and their personality changes afterwards. We will not get the opportunity to see or talk to those who were there. However, we have the opportunity to surround ourselves with the evidence. Just as in a courtroom, when you are surrounded by all the evidence, a psychological switch is flipped. Whether guilty or not guilty, whether liar or Lord.